Lyra had always known that her life would be different from the other elves. While they spent their days in the crystal towers studying ancient histories and perfecting their magical arts, she found herself drawn to the forbidden archives at the edge of the great library. These archives contained information about the outside universe, about the billions of civilizations that existed beyond their peaceful world. The elders had warned her many times that this curiosity would bring her nothing but trouble, but Lyra could not help herself. She felt as though something inside her was calling her toward a greater destiny. The discovery of the three suns had changed everything. For the first time in 5,000 years, the elves realized they were not alone on Kiandra Prime. The suns were not real suns at all, but massive energy stations created by the Ancient Ones to power the defensive shields that protected their world. Lyra discovered this truth by accident, while studying old records in the deepest part of the archive. When she brought this information to the Council of Elders, they dismissed her findings as fantasies and locked the archives completely. But it was too late. The information had already spread among the younger elves. They began to ask questions. They wanted to know what lay beyond their world. They wanted to explore the universe and understand their place in it. For the first time, the peaceful elven society began to fracture along generational lines. Then came the message through the broken relay station. Lyra was in her personal chamber when the warning arrived. The relay station had been abandoned for centuries, a relic from the time when the elves still traveled among the stars. She had repaired it in secret, using ancient technology that she barely understood. The message came through as a holographic projection that filled her entire room with light. The collective had found them. A massive empire of synthetic beings and enslaved species. They controlled a third of the known galaxy. They were coming to Kiandra Prime and they wanted everything. The message was not a threat. It was a statement of inevitability. The collective did not threaten. They simply arrived and took what they wanted. Lyra immediately called for an emergency council meeting. When she revealed what she had discovered, the elders were not shocked by the arrival of the collective. Instead, they were shocked that she had repaired the relay station without permission. But there was no time for punishment. The ships would arrive in 3 rotations and the elves had to decide what to do. The council debated through the night. Some wanted to surrender immediately and hope for the best. Others wanted to hide in the dimensional refuges that had been prepared thousands of years ago. A few, mostly the younger elves, wanted to fight, but everyone knew that fighting was impossible. The elves had not engaged in warfare for millennia. Their entire culture was built around peace, contemplation, and harmony with nature. Lyra listened to everything, but she said nothing. She was thinking about the humans. The humans had only arrived in this sector of space 200 years ago. When the collective first encountered them, they had expected the conquest to take a few weeks. Instead, it had taken years, and even then the humans had not truly been conquered. They had simply learned to hide in the frontier settlements, in the places where the collective's reach was weakest. Lyra had studied human history obsessively. She had read about their wars, their revolutions, their incredible ability to survive against odds that should have destroyed them completely. There was something different about humans. They refused to accept defeat. When everything was taken from them, they found new ways to survive. When they were told they were too weak to fight, they fought anyway. When they were told they would fail, they succeeded. It was this quality that had made them so dangerous to the collective's plans. After the council meeting ended, Lyra made a decision that would change the course of her entire civilization. She gathered a small group of younger elves, the ones who had been asking questions and seeking answers. She told them what she was planning to do. Most of them thought she had gone mad, but a few, including her closest friend Melody, offered to help. Lyra prepared in secret. She gathered supplies and technology. Most importantly, she contacted the 2 dragons that had been living in the mountains near the Crystal Towers. These dragons were not like the creatures of legend. They were sentient beings with their own thoughts, emotions, and desires. Their names were Ember and Starfire. They had chosen to live near the elves because they appreciated the peaceful nature of their civilization. They had never been caged or controlled. They were free creatures who had simply decided to be allies with the elves. When Lyra explained her plan to the dragons, they understood immediately. They had been feeling the approaching danger. They had sensed through the energy fields of the planet that something was changing. They agreed to help her, not because they were loyal servants, but because they were partners. The dragons wanted to survive just as much as the elves did. On the night before the collective's ships would arrive, Lyra rode on Ember's back across the desert plains. Starfire flew above them, her massive wings catching the light of the stars. They were heading toward the human settlement, a rough collection of metal buildings on the frontier. Lyra had never met a human before, but she had studied them enough to know what to expect. She hoped that the humans would listen to her proposal. She hoped that they would see an opportunity instead of a burden. The journey took most of the night. As they flew closer to the human settlement, Lyra could see their simple defensive systems and their crude weapon stations. The humans were fighters. She could tell from the way they had built their settlement. Every structure was positioned for defense. Every entrance had multiple escape routes. This was a civilization that had learned to survive by preparing for attack at any moment. Ember descended toward the landing platform just outside the settlement's perimeter. Starfire landed beside them, her wings folding carefully so as not to appear threatening. Lyra climbed down from Ember's back and stood in the darkness waiting to see if the humans would respond. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then lights illuminated across the settlement. Weapons came online. Alarm sirens began to wail. Lyra raised her hands in a peaceful gesture, hoping that the humans would recognize the universal symbol of surrender and non-aggression. A figure emerged from the largest building, walking slowly toward Lyra. It was a woman with weathered skin and a mechanical right arm. She moved with the confidence of someone who had faced danger many times before and had always survived. When she was close enough to see Lyra's face clearly, she smiled. The woman introduced herself as Victoria Price, the commander of the human settlement. She told Lyra that she had been expecting someone like her to arrive eventually. The humans had their own sources of information. They knew about the collective's movements. They had known about the elves of Kiandra Prime for months. What they had not known was whether the elves would try to fight or try to run. Lyra explained everything to Victoria. She talked about the collective's arrival, the ultimatum, the choice between slavery and resistance. She spoke about the dragons and what they meant to her people. She told Victoria about the human history she had studied, about their incredible ability to survive and adapt and overcome obstacles that should have been impossible. Victoria listened carefully to every word. When Lyra finished speaking, the human commander was silent for a long moment. Then she asked a simple question. "What do you want from us?" Lyra took a deep breath and answered honestly, "We want to learn how to refuse to be small. We want to learn how to fight even when we believe we cannot win. We want to learn how to be human." Victoria smiled again and Lyra could see respect in her eyes. She extended her mechanical hand toward Lyra in a gesture of friendship. The two women shook hands under the stars, and in that moment, something important began to form. It was not just an alliance. It was the beginning of something that would challenge the foundations of the entire galactic empire. The human settlement was smaller than Lyra had expected, but it was also more organized and efficient than anything she had seen in the elven cities. Victoria took her on a complete tour, showing her the weapons systems, the communication centers, the food production facilities, and the living quarters where over 300 humans made their homes. What impressed Lyra the most was the attitude of the people. Despite living in constant danger on the frontier, they moved through their daily routines with a kind of quiet determination that suggested nothing could break their spirit. Victoria explained the human philosophy to Lyra as they walked through the settlement. Humans understood that life was difficult and that suffering was inevitable. Instead of trying to avoid pain, they accepted it as part of existence and focused on creating meaning in their lives. They fought not because they thought they would win, but because the fight itself gave their lives purpose. This perspective was completely foreign to the elven way of thinking, but Lyra found it fascinating. They arrived at Victoria's command center, a large room filled with screens and equipment that monitored everything happening in the surrounding region. Victoria called a meeting of her senior officers and introduced them to Lyra. There were 7 of them, each with their own specialty and their own reason for being on the frontier. They were skeptical of the elf's proposal at first, but Victoria had a way of convincing people to take chances on unlikely situations. Lyra presented her analysis of the situation to the human officers. She showed them the technical specifications of the collective's warships. She explained the weapons systems and the defensive capabilities. She talked about the collective's military strategies based on historical records she had studied. She described their weakness, which was their dependence on centralized command structures and their inability to adapt to unexpected situations. The humans listened carefully, and Lyra could see them processing the information. After she finished, a human named Marcus asked her a direct question. He wanted to know why the elves had not responded to the collective's ultimatum with a simple surrender. It would have been the safest choice for the individual elves, even if it meant slavery. Why had Lyra decided to seek out the humans and propose resistance instead? Lyra answered the question honestly. She said that some things were more important than individual safety. If the elves chose to surrender, they would lose their freedom, their culture, and their right to determine their own future. More importantly, the dragons would be turned into weapons, tools of the collective's endless hunger for conquest. Lyra could not accept that outcome. She had come to believe that some fights were worth fighting even when you might lose. Victoria nodded slowly and then made a decision. The human settlement would help the elves. It would not be easy, and there was a very high probability of failure, but Victoria believed it was the right choice. She told her officers to begin preparing their forces immediately. They would need to create a defense network, coordinate with the elves, and develop strategies that combined human tactical thinking with elven magical abilities. Over the next 2 cycles, the settlement became a center of intense activity. Elves began arriving in small groups, transported through secret routes that avoided the collective's sensor networks. The humans helped them settle into the frontier settlement. There were cultural clashes at first. The elves were not used to the rough, direct communication style of the humans. The humans found the elves' formal traditions and careful politeness somewhat frustrating. But gradually, the 2 civilizations began to understand each other. Lyra worked closely with Victoria to coordinate the defense strategy. They decided that the key to their success would be unpredictability. The collective expected the elves to either surrender or try to escape through the dimensional gates. The idea that they would fight back with human assistance would be so unexpected that it might give them an initial advantage. The dragons played a crucial role in the planning. Ember and Starfire helped Lyra understand the energy patterns that flowed through Keandra Prime. They could sense the approach of the collective's ships days before they would arrive. More importantly, the dragons understood technology in ways that even Lyra had not fully grasped. They could manipulate energy fields and disrupt electronic systems through pure mental force, combined with their natural abilities. A human engineer named Patricia worked with the dragons to develop new tactics. She created a network of electromagnetic generators that could be controlled and directed through the dragons' mental abilities. When the collective's ships arrived, the generators would create pulses that could disable weapon systems and communication arrays. It was a crude system, but it had potential. One evening, Lyra sat with Victoria in the command center and asked her a question that had been bothering her since the beginning. She wanted to know why the humans were willing to risk so much for a civilization they had only just met. Lyra expected Victoria to talk about strategy or tactical advantage, but instead, the human commander gave a different answer. Victoria explained that humans fought for principle as much as for survival. When the collective had first tried to conquer humanity, many human leaders had wanted to surrender and simply accept the terms that the collective offered. Those leaders had argued that resistance was futile and that accepting defeat would minimize casualties. But there had been other voices, humans who believed that some things were worth fighting for even if you might lose. Those voices had eventually won out, and humanity had survived. Victoria had chosen to follow those voices, to believe in the possibility of victory even when victory seemed impossible. She told Lyra that this was what made humanity dangerous to empires like the collective. Humans did not calculate probability and accept defeat before the battle was even fought. Humans calculated probability and fought anyway. This was both a strength and a weakness, Victoria admitted. It had led to some spectacular failures, but it had also led to some incredible successes. Lyra understood something in that moment. The elves had always been focused on creating harmony and maintaining peace, but they had never truly understood what it meant to struggle against overwhelming odds and refuse to surrender. The humans had built their entire civilization on exactly that principle. They were natural allies. As the first cycle came to an end, reports began arriving about the collective's ships. They had entered the outer atmosphere of Keandra Prime. The attack was imminent. All the preparation and planning was about to be put to the test. The settlement went into full alert status. The humans took their positions. The elves prepared their magical abilities. The dragons positioned themselves in the mountains, ready to respond when their mental connection to Lyra told them the moment had arrived. In the command center, Victoria stood beside Lyra and watched the screens. The collective's warships were exactly where the elves had predicted they would be. The first strike would come in approximately 2 hours. Victoria turned to Lyra and smiled that same confident smile she had given on the night they first met. "This is the moment when everything changes," Victoria said simply. "This is when we prove that the universe still has room for beings who refuse to accept their own extinction. Let us show the collective what happens when an empire meets resistance that comes from the heart, instead of from calculation alone." Lyra placed her hand on Ember's scaled head. Feeling the dragon's readiness and determination through their mental connection, she felt Starfire's presence as well, the larger dragon circling above the settlement with incredible grace. In that moment, Lyra was no longer afraid. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited them. The alarm that signaled the beginning of the attack echoed through the settlement. The battle that would change everything was about to begin. The first attack came with incredible force and precision. 3 massive warships descended through the atmosphere of Kiandra Prime, their weapon systems already charging as they targeted the human settlement below. The collective had done this hundreds of times before. They knew exactly how to destroy resistance. They knew the tactics and the strategies. They were confident in their dominance because they had never encountered an enemy that had truly refused to break. But this time would be different. As soon as the weapons began to fire, Lyra transmitted through her mental link with Ember and Starfire. The dragons rose from their hidden positions in the mountains with breathtaking speed. They did not fly toward the warships to engage in direct combat. Instead, they moved to specific positions that Patricia had calculated carefully over the previous cycles. The electromagnetic generators came online at exactly the right moment. The pulses shot upward into the sky, hitting the first warship's energy shields and creating waves of disruption that spread through the vessel's systems. The ship's targeting computer experienced a cascade failure. Its weapon systems, unable to get accurate targeting information, fired in random directions. One of its own secondary weapons batteries was struck by friendly fire, creating an internal explosion that spread rapidly through the vessel. The dragons amplified the electromagnetic pulses through their own natural abilities. They could sense the energy patterns inside the collective's technology, and they could manipulate those patterns in ways that no conventional weapon could match. The first warship's engines began to fail. The entire vessel shuddered as system after system cascaded into failure. On the ground, Victoria led her human forces in a coordinated assault. They had positioned weapons at strategic points around the settlement, and now they used them with devastating efficiency. But their weapons were not focused on the ships in the sky. Instead, they targeted the landing pods that the collective was attempting to deploy from the second warship. The collective had expected to land troops on the ground and overwhelm the settlement through superior numbers and training. What they did not expect was the incredible accuracy and coordination of the human defenders. Each landing pod that emerged from the collective warship was targeted and destroyed before it could reach the ground. The humans understood the mathematics of warfare, and they were applying those principles perfectly. Lyra stood in the command center, her hands glowing with magical energy as she coordinated the elven forces. The younger elves, the ones who had wanted to fight instead of flee, were now proving their worth. They used their magical abilities to reinforce the human weapons, to strengthen the defenses around the settlement, and to protect their allies from the collective's counterattacks. The second warship, realizing that its first strike had failed completely, began to adjust its tactics. It moved higher into the atmosphere and attempted to use a different approach. This ship fired not at the settlement, but at the mountains where the dragons were positioned. The collective had sensors sophisticated enough to detect the dragon's location, and they understood that these creatures represented a significant threat. But the dragons were faster and more intelligent than the collective had anticipated. Starfire intercepted the incoming fire by creating a barrier of concentrated energy. Her massive body twisted and wove through the explosions, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a creature so large. Ember struck at the warship's hull, using both his physical strength and his mental abilities to damage the exterior plating. Victoria watched all of this from the command center with a mixture of amazement and satisfaction. She turned to Lyra and said simply, "Your dragons fight like soldiers who understand tactics. They are not just attacking. They are working together with our people." Lyra smiled and responded, "They understand that this is not just about their survival. This is about something bigger. The dragons chose to help us because they believe in something. That belief makes them stronger than any weapon." The third warship had been hanging back, observing the conflict and waiting for an opportunity to strike. Now it began its descent, moving quickly toward the settlement with weapons charged. This ship was larger and more heavily armed than the other two. It represented the real striking force of the collective's initial assault. But Patricia had anticipated this possibility. She had been monitoring the energy signatures of all three ships since the moment they entered the atmosphere. She had calculated that the third ship would arrive at this position at this exact time. She triggered the final network of electromagnetic generators, creating a massive pulse that rose from the ground like an invisible tidal wave. The pulse hit the third warship at the moment when its shields were momentarily weakened by the transition from high altitude to lower altitude flight. The entire vessel shuddered as its main power systems were disrupted. The ship's controls became unresponsive. The pilots, without the guidance of their computer systems, found themselves flying a vessel that was starting to fail all around them. The first warship had already been forced to initiate emergency withdrawal procedures. Its systems were so damaged that the crew barely managed to get the vessel to climb back toward space. The second warship had been damaged badly enough that its commanders decided to retreat as well. They were designed to conquer inferior forces quickly. When quick conquest became impossible, the entire tactical doctrine fell apart. The third warship attempted to crash land near the settlement, trying to deploy its troops before the ship became completely non-functional. But Victoria had prepared for this contingency as well. The human forces concentrated their fire on the landing troops, and the dragons descended to prevent any organized grouping of collective forces. It was over in less than 3 hours. The first collective assault had been a complete failure. All three warships were either destroyed or had retreated to space. The troops that had managed to land were captured or scattered. The settlement and the elves had survived. In the aftermath of the battle, humans and elves worked together to treat the wounded and secure the perimeter. The casualties were lower than anyone had expected. This was because the collective's tactics had been designed to achieve quick victory through overwhelming force. When that force was negated through unexpected tactics and technological disruption, the collective had no alternative strategies to fall back on. Victoria met with Lyra at the edge of the settlement where they could see the damaged warship smoking on the distant plain. The human commander placed her mechanical hand on Lyra's shoulder and spoke quietly. "Your people are warriors now," Victoria said, "not because you chose violence, but because you chose to exist and defend your right to exist. That is the most honorable reason to fight." Lyra felt tears in her eyes as she looked at the elves and humans working together to repair the defenses and clear away the debris from the battle. She thought about the council of elders who had wanted to surrender or flee. She thought about how different this moment would have been if she had listened to them instead of following her instincts and seeking out the humans. "The collective will return," Lyra said. "This was only the first assault. They have many more ships and they will not make the same mistakes again." Victoria nodded slowly. "Yes, they will return. But when they do, we will be ready. We will learn from this battle. We will improve our tactics. We will adapt to their new strategies. This is what humans do. We face adversity and we survive. Now you and your people are learning to do the same." Ember and Starfire landed beside them, their bodies marked with the scars of combat, but their eyes still bright with determination. The dragons had proven themselves to be more than just magical beings or weapons of war. They had shown themselves to be intelligent, tactical partners who understood the value of working together. As the first cycle of the New Age came to an end, the frontier settlement was no longer just a human outpost. It had become something new. It had become a symbol of resistance against the collective's attempts to dominate the universe. And everyone who had fought in the battle knew that this was only the beginning. The following weeks were filled with intense preparation and planning. Lyra and Victoria worked together to strengthen their defenses and prepare for the collective's inevitable return. They knew that the collective would not send the same type of assault twice. The Empire's military forces were massive and diverse, with countless tactical options available to them. The settlement had won the first battle through innovation and surprise, but surprise could only work once. The elves brought more of their ancient technology from the crystal towers. Some of it had not been used in thousands of years, but with the help of Patricia and the human engineers, they managed to restore it to working condition. The combination of elven magic and human engineering created something unique. They built hybrid systems that were more powerful than either civilization could have created alone. Lyra spent hours in meditation with Ember and Starfire, learning to understand their abilities in deeper and more profound ways. She discovered that the dragons could manipulate energy patterns in ways that no one had previously understood. They could create temporary dimensional rifts, restructure molecular bonds, and perceive threats across multiple spectrums simultaneously. With this knowledge, Lyra and the dragons developed new tactics and strategies that would be ready when the collective returned. Victoria trained the elves in human combat tactics and survival strategies. She taught them about the psychology of warfare, about how to maintain morale when facing overwhelming odds, about how to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The elves, who had never engaged in warfare before, proved to be quick learners. They understood the importance of discipline and focus. They saw themselves not as individual soldiers, but as part of a larger force working toward a common goal. One evening, Melody, Lyra's closest friend from the elven settlement, asked her a question that many of the younger elves were thinking. Melody wanted to know if Lyra ever regretted her decision to seek out the humans and resist the collective, instead of simply accepting surrender or escape. Lyra thought carefully before answering. She admitted that there were moments when the fear overwhelmed her, moments when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake that would lead to the destruction of her entire civilization. But those moments were always followed by the realization that surrender would have been a death of a different kind. The elves would have survived as slaves, working in collective factories and mines, their culture slowly erased by the pressure of authoritarian control. "No," Lyra finally said to Melody. "I do not regret this choice. I would regret it if I had chosen any other path. To refuse to fight is to accept that we deserve to be erased from existence. I will never accept that, and I will always be grateful that the humans showed us how to believe in ourselves again." 3 weeks after the first battle, the sensors detected new movement at the edges of the system. The collective was returning, and this time they were sending more ships. The settlement scouts reported at least 5 major warships accompanied by dozens of smaller fighter craft. The collective was preparing for a siege, not a quick assault. Victoria called a council meeting with all of her senior officers and the leaders of the elven forces. She laid out the tactical situation honestly. The settlement could not win a prolonged siege. If the collective managed to establish an orbital blockade and prevent any supply ships from reaching the frontier, the settlement would eventually run out of food and medical supplies. The humans and elves would be forced to surrender or evacuate, but Victoria also presented a different strategy. Instead of defending the settlement passively, they could launch a preemptive strike. The human commander had been studying the collective's tactics and behaviors, and she believed she had identified a weakness. The collective's warships relied on a central command network to coordinate their actions. If that network could be disrupted, the ships would lose the ability to work together effectively. Individual ships might still be dangerous, but they would be far less formidable than a coordinated fleet. The plan was incredibly risky. It would require the dragons to fly directly to the collective's command vessel and disrupt its communication systems from the inside. There was no guarantee they would succeed. The command vessel was heavily defended, and the collective would be expecting some kind of attack. Lyra asked Ember and Starfire if they were willing to attempt this mission. She made it clear to the dragons that she understood the danger and would not blame them if they decided they were not willing to risk their lives on such a desperate action. But the dragons responded immediately. They had chosen to ally with the elves and humans, and they would see that choice through to its logical conclusion. They were ready to fly into danger if it meant protecting their friends and their world. Patricia worked frantically to modify the electromagnetic generators so they could be installed directly into the dragons' bodies. The system would be temporary and somewhat unstable, but it would give Ember and Starfire the ability to disrupt energy patterns from within the collective's command vessel itself. The installation was painful for the dragons, and Lyra felt echoes of their discomfort through their mental connection. But neither dragon complained or wavered in their determination. The night before the assault was planned, Lyra stood alone in the courtyard where Ember and Starfire rested. She placed her hands on each dragon's head and spoke to them silently through their mental link. "Tomorrow, you will fly into the heart of our enemy's power. You will do something that no being in this galaxy has ever done before. You will strike at the foundations of the collective's military dominance. I want you to know that regardless of what happens, you have already changed everything. You have shown the universe that the collective is not invincible." The dragons rumbled their understanding, and Lyra felt their courage and their acceptance of whatever fate awaited them. As dawn broke over the frontier settlement, the collective's fleet took its position in high orbit around Kiandra Prime. The humans and elves waited, watching the screens as the massive warships moved into optimal positions. Then Victoria gave the signal. Ember and Starfire took flight, climbing rapidly through the atmosphere toward the collective fleet. The moment they appeared on the collective's sensor screens, alarms began to sound across all 5 warships. The fighters were launched to intercept the dragons. The warship's weapons came online, but the dragons were not alone. Every human fighter at the settlement took to the skies, engaging the collective's interceptors in the fiercest aerial battle that Kiandra Prime had ever witnessed. The humans used superior tactics and better knowledge of local, atmospheric conditions to hold their own against the collective's superior technology. Ember and Starfire flew directly through the chaos of the air battle, weaving between explosions and weapons fire. They moved with single-minded determination toward the command vessel. Nothing could stop them. Nothing could distract them from their purpose. They had been given a mission and they would complete it. As they approached the command vessel, they dove directly at its hull. The impact was tremendous, but both dragons survived. They began to tear into the ship's exterior, using both physical force and the electromagnetic disruption technology that Patricia had installed within their bodies. The command vessel's shields flickered and failed. Inside the settlement's command center, Victoria watched the screens and allowed herself a small smile. The plan was working. The collective's command network was being disrupted exactly as they had calculated. Inside the collective's command vessel, chaos erupted as the system failures cascaded through every critical function. The dragons had succeeded in their mission far better than anyone had dared hope. Ember and Starfire had not just disrupted the communication network. They had damaged the entire core infrastructure of the command ship. The vessel's captain, a synthetic being named Designate 7, attempted to order a full evacuation, but even that command could not be transmitted effectively across the ship. Back at the settlement, Victoria saw her opportunity and took it immediately. She ordered the entire human fighter force to launch a coordinated strike against the command vessel before its systems could be brought back online. The fighter pilots, many of whom had trained for months to execute exactly this type of maneuver, responded with perfect precision. They flew through the chaos of the aerial battle and attacked the command vessel with everything they had. The first warship in the collective fleet began to disintegrate under the combined assault. Explosions ripped through its hull. The ship's reactors overloaded. Within moments, a massive explosion lit up the sky above Kiandra Prime as the command vessel tore itself apart. The other 4 collective warships lost their central command at that exact moment. Without the guidance and coordination provided by the command network, they were suddenly operating independently. They attempted to maintain their formations and continue the battle, but their tactics became confused and ineffective. They began firing on each other by accident. They made tactical errors that exposed their weak points to the defending forces below. Ember and Starfire, moving through the expanding debris field created by the destruction of the command vessel, veered away from the impact zone. They had survived their suicide mission by pure luck and exceptional piloting. The electromagnetic disruption equipment inside their bodies was now barely functional, but it had served its purpose. The 2 dragons climbed back toward the settlement, navigating through the remaining fighter craft that were still engaged in aerial combat. Victoria ordered her forces to concentrate on the nearest warship. Using tactics that they had developed and refined over weeks of intensive planning, the human fighters and the elven mages worked together to systematically destroy the vessel's weapons and defensive systems. The warship became crippled and unable to return fire. Its captain, recognizing that defeat was imminent, ordered the vessel to jump into hyperspace and retreat from the system. As each of the collective warships attempted to retreat, they were pursued by human fighters and harassed by the dragons. The coordinated assault was devastating. By the time the last collective vessel managed to escape into hyperspace, 3 of the 5 warships had been destroyed or crippled beyond repair. The other 2 were limping away, their systems damaged and their crews demoralized. The battle was over. Keandra Prime had been defended. The collective had been defeated not once but twice. In the days that followed, the settlement transformed into a center of celebration and reflection. Humans and elves worked together to repair the damage caused by the battle and to honor those who had been lost. There were casualties on both sides, brave individuals who had given their lives to protect their homes and their futures. Victoria ordered a memorial to be built in the center of the settlement, a place where both humans and elves could remember and honor the fallen. Lyra organized a traditional elven ceremony to mark the end of the conflict. The ritual was ancient and had not been performed in thousands of years, but the younger elves remembered the words and the symbols. As Lyra conducted the ceremony, she spoke about transformation and sacrifice and the unexpected connections that could form between different peoples when they chose to stand together against darkness. Victoria attended the ceremony, standing beside Lyra at the altar. When it was finished, the human commander spoke to the assembled humans and elves. She talked about what she had learned from her allies. She spoke about how the elves had shown the humans the value of contemplation and patience and careful planning. She talked about how the dragons had demonstrated that intelligence and courage could take many forms. She concluded by saying that the settlement was no longer just a human outpost or an elven refuge. It had become something entirely new, a place where multiple civilizations had learned to work together and achieve something neither could have achieved alone. Over the following weeks, representatives from both the human and elven communities met to discuss the future. They made a decision that surprised many observers across the galaxy. The elves would not return to their crystal towers. Instead, they would remain in the frontier settlement and work with the humans to build a new civilization that combined the best qualities of both cultures. It would not be easy. There would be conflicts and misunderstandings. But there was now a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. Lyra spent her evenings riding on Ember's back across the desert plains, with starfire flying beside them through the starlit sky. She would think about the journey that had brought her to this place and this moment. She had started as a scholar and dreamer in a peaceful elven city. She had become a warrior and a leader. She had learned that the most important strength was not the ability to avoid conflict, but the ability to face conflict and continue to believe in a better future. One evening, as the 3 suns set over the horizon, Lyra received a message through the restored relay station. It came from the Council of Elders, the group that had opposed her plan to seek out the humans. The message acknowledged the success of her strategy and officially recognized her as a leader of the elven people, but more importantly, the message contained an invitation. The elders wanted Lyra to return to the Crystal Towers and share her experiences with the younger generation of elves. They wanted to understand how their isolated civilization could engage with the wider galaxy while still preserving their core values and traditions. Lyra accepted the invitation, and she made plans to return to the Crystal Towers for a brief period. But she knew that her true home was now on the frontier, working alongside her human allies and her dragon companions. The frontier had shown her what was possible when different peoples chose to believe in each other and in the potential for a better future. Before she left for the Crystal Towers, Lyra spent time with Victoria. The 2 women had become more than allies. They had become true friends, separated by biology and culture but united by shared values and mutual respect. "You have changed everything," Lyra said to Victoria. "You taught us how to believe in ourselves even when the odds seemed impossible. You taught us that hope is not a luxury, it is a necessity." Victoria smiled and placed her mechanical hand on Lyra's shoulder. "No," she responded. "You changed everything. You had the courage to seek help. When your own civilization told you that resistance was impossible, you believed that we could become partners instead of remaining strangers. That belief is what made all of this possible." As Lyra prepared for her journey back to the Crystal Towers, she looked out across the frontier settlement. She saw humans and elves working together, building structures that combined elven architectural elegance with human practical efficiency. She saw children from both species playing together in the courtyard. She saw Ember and Starfire resting peacefully, no longer burdened by the electromagnetic equipment, but still bearing the mental and physical scars of their mission. The universe had been changed by the events on Kiandra Prime. The collective had learned that there were civilizations willing to fight against their dominance. Other frontier settlements had heard the news and were now making plans to resist the collective's expansion. The empire that had seemed so invincible had been proven to be vulnerable. But more importantly, the universe had been changed by the simple act of choosing connection over isolation, by choosing to believe that different peoples could work together and create something greater than what they could create alone. As Lyra rode toward the crystal towers with Melody and a small escort of human soldiers and elven warriors, she carried with her the knowledge that the fight was far from over. The collective would return and new challenges would emerge. But she also carried with her something far more valuable than weapons or defensive systems. She carried hope, and she knew that as long as hope existed, as long as beings refused to accept their own extinction, the future could always be changed.